They never expected betrayal would come not from the enemy's sword, but from the hands of a queen. A woman draped in silk, cloaked in diplomacy, whose smile masked the ruin of thousands. In the heat of the Crusades, when blood stained the earth and kings gambled with kingdoms, she chose a different game. One not fought with armies, but with gold. And the Crusaders? They never saw it coming. Our story begins not on the battlefield, but in a palace overlooking the sea. A place where luxury met cunning, where words were sharper than blades, and where one woman, Queen Sibylla of Cyprus, played a role that has long been forgotten, buried beneath layers of glorified wars and heroic tales. They say history is written by the victors. But what happens when the victor was never holding a sword, only a secret? It was the year 1191. The Third Crusade was in full swing. Richard the Lionheart had just captured Acre after a brutal siege. Blood flowed like wine in the streets, and the air was thick with rot and vengeance. As the Christian armies prepared to march on Jerusalem, they sought refuge and supply from nearby allies. One of them was the island of Cyprus, a strategic jewel in the eastern Mediterranean. At the time, Cyprus had recently changed hands. Richard had conquered the island from Isaac Komnenos, a Greek usurper who had dared to claim it as his own. The queen, she had once been his consort. Sibylla, born of Byzantine nobility, was no ordinary woman. She had survived court intrigue, exile, and betrayal long before the Crusaders arrived. When Richard captured Cyprus, he sold it to the Knights Templar, but their rule was brief and unpopular. Rebellion brewed, and soon the island was offered to Guy of Lusignan, a king without a kingdom, disgraced after the fall of Jerusalem in 1187. And thus, the Lusignan dynasty began in Cyprus, with Queen Sibylla by his side. Or so it seemed. To the Crusaders, Cyprus became a lifeline, a place to rest, resupply, and plan their next move. But what they didn't know was that behind the scenes, gold was changing hands. Secrets were being sold. And Queen Sibylla, who had been watching the tides of war longer than any man alive, was quietly weighing her options. It was no secret that the Crusaders had enemies not just in Saladin's forces, but within their own ranks. Friction grew between the French and the English. The Germans distrusted the Byzantines. No one trusted the Venetians, and everyone underestimated the Cypriot queen. But Sibylla understood what they didn't. She saw that the Crusaders, for all their divine zeal, were fractured and desperate. And desperation was a currency she knew how to spend. Whispers of her meetings with emissaries from the Muslim world began to surface. At first, dismissed as rumors. After all, why would a Christian queen conspire with the enemy? But the truth was more complicated. The queen had no loyalty to the cross or the crescent. Her loyalty was to survival and the preservation of her bloodline's power. And in that brutal calculus, gold was more useful than glory. According to overlooked letters and intercepted documents, Queen Sibylla provided intelligence to Saladin's generals in exchange for safe trade routes and a hefty tribute. She offered insight into Crusader ship movements, troop numbers, and even the weaknesses in their naval defenses along the Cypriot coast. These revelations never reached the ears of the Crusader kings, not until it was far too late. In 1192, just as Richard the Lionheart was preparing a final assault on Jerusalem, the Muslim forces launched a devastating counterattack. Not in the Holy Land, but at sea. Several key supply ships vanished. Others were ambushed with uncanny precision. The Crusaders were baffled. How could the enemy know their route so well? They never suspected the Queen. In one account, written by an anonymous monk of the Abbey of Montserrat decades later, it is said that Richard himself began to suspect foul play. But he lacked proof. And confronting a queen, especially one allied through marriage to the Lusignan line, was a risk he could not afford. He left Cyprus in haste, his health failing, Jerusalem unconquered, and his dreams of eternal glory shattered. Meanwhile, Queen Sibylla's coffers grew fat. Years later, when Guy of Lusignan died, Sibylla vanished from the chronicles. Some say she retired to a secluded convent. Others claim she returned to Constantinople under a new name, richer than any noblewoman in exile had ever been. But one thing is clear, the Crusaders never regained their momentum. And Cyprus, though claimed by Christendom, remained a place of shadows, where alliances were bought, not forged. Historians often debate whether Queen Sibylla truly betrayed the Crusaders, or whether she merely ensured her own survival in a world ruled by violence and hypocrisy. But the clues left behind suggest more than self-preservation. They point to a masterstroke of quiet treason, a chess move that turned the tide of a holy war, not with armies, but with information. And perhaps that is what makes her story so dangerous, because it wasn't written in blood on the battlefield, but in silence, behind palace walls, in whispers, in coin, in choices no one dared question at the time. The chronicles of the Crusades are filled with tales of heroic knights, devout kings, and noble martyrs. But few speak of the ones who watched from behind the curtains, the ones who didn't ride into battle but still shaped its outcome, the ones like Queen Sibylla, forgotten, underestimated, and deadly. So the next time you hear stories of the Crusades, remember, not all betrayals happen in plain sight. Some wear crowns, some wear veils, and some are bought with gold. And perhaps the greatest victory of all is to be written out of history entirely.